About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
Hello, welcome to Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, your host, and through this series of programs, I'm sharing some of the history, explaining some of the ideas and experiments, and introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research. We'll also take your questions and explore some news items. You can contact me at ruth@noeticmoments.org or just go to the website, noeticmoments.org, and fill out the form. Over the last few weeks, we've been working through a 12-part series on evolving models of consciousness, the history of explorations and discoveries of what the mind is and how it works. You can catch up on them on our website, noeticmoments.org, or here at KXCR FM. Go to kxcr.org and go to the archives and look up the show. And if you did catch an earlier show, you may remember that we have two general ways of thinking about consciousness. In a world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is being awake and aware, and knowing what's going on around us. In the field of noetics, though, as it's been emerging, consciousness is the processes and products of mind, both in our awareness and outside of it. It's also profound human experience, and ultimately, consciousness is beginning to be seen as what connects us all. In the first episodes, I introduced myself and how the field of noetics came to be. You can find those on our websites. I talked about Sigmund Freud, who opened the door to understanding the processes of mind in the early 1900s, and some of Carl Jung's ideas on how our own individual consciousness must be understood within the framework of what he called the collective consciousness, or the collective unconscious. Then I skipped a few decades and introduced Charles Tart, who established the idea of states of consciousness, each with its own set of physiological, emotional, and mental characteristics. And last week, we talked about Julian Jaynes, who related consciousness to the right and left hemispheres of the uppermost part of our brain. Today, we're exploring the idea of mind and consciousness as a field, particularly through the experimental work and discoveries of Kurt Lewin, Rupert Sheldrake, Dirk Meijer, and Johnjoe McFadden. Now, the idea of mind as a field is hardly new. In the Vedas, as early as 3000 BCE, consciousness, called Brahman, underlies and infuses everything. In the 1600s, Baruch Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher, stated and developed a very complex logical framework based on his mystical experience that everything is God. The British bishop, George Berkeley, or Berkeley, early 1700s, said that everything is God's dream. The German philosophers in the late 1700s, particularly Hegel, said that God and the universe are one, and Schopenhauer in the early 1800s proposed that humanity shares a common will, which he identified as contrary to that of God. American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson stated in the mid-1800s in his essay called History There is one mind common to all humanity, and each man is an inlet and an outlet to the same. And of course, Carl Jung spoke of the collective consciousness that affects us all. By the time we get into the early 20th century, we find Emil Durkheim, a sociologist and anthropologist, referring to the shared ideals, beliefs, and norms of a group as their collective consciousness, saying that it makes it possible for people to function in social systems, whether they be families, organizations, or even nations. And in the 1980s, John Hagelin offered what he called a unified field theory of consciousness, and he's been working on the mechanism for this ever since, which we will talk about in some detail more in a later show. Today, though, we're going to start with Kurt Lewin, a German-Jewish philosopher and psychologist who grew up while Freud was working. He completed his PhD just before World War I and came back from the war to launch a whole new way of thinking about people, as a product not just of their history, as suggested by Freud, but of their current environment as well. Levine and his students wrote a series of journal articles in 1926 that talked about force fields affecting individual behavior, both within the mind and in the situation they were experiencing at the moment. They all drew topological maps of how the relationships between these different aspects affected each other, and they formulated an equation, B equals a function of P, E, which is to say behavior is a function of personal history and environment, to summarize their models. Levine was invited to the U.S. to lead some experiments in the 1930s to test his field idea and some of the others, and they became a citizen shortly before World War II. Among other things, during those years, he demonstrated that democratic processes were more effective in achieving high levels of creativity and enthusiasm in small groups, developing a model that he called group dynamics. And he developed action research and sensitivity training models and processes while he was at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, all of which became the basis for Peter Senge's learning organizations 40 years later. Now, in Levine's field model, he's using the word field as in playing field or field of activity, rather than as an electromagnetic or physical field. He was not describing how the brain and mind work physically, but how they operated in the world, how they were applied in the world around us, and how the world affects the individual's thoughts and actions. But another use of that word was emerging in the sciences of those years. Physicists were talking about electromagnetic fields that surrounded atoms and atomic particles and the Earth and the Sun. Biologists were talking about morphic fields that determined the shape that an embryo would develop into, guiding individual cells to turn and change at appropriate points in their growth as the fetus became the infant and the infant became the adult. That idea that some sort of field surrounded and infused living things was popularized in the USSR and by the book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, with the process that became known as Curian photography, which is used today by folks who make photographic images of auras at psychic fairs and such places. It was offered in a different way, though, by an evolutionary biologist at Cambridge University in the UK, Rupert Sheldrake, whose 1980s book, A New Science of Life, suggested that whole species had morphic fields, not just individuals, and that the fields of similar species resonate such that an evolutionary change in one would soon lead to a change in related species who resonated with that field. He called it the theory of morphic resonance. And it applied, he said, not only to species evolving, but to individuals learning. He did experiments. He invited more experiments, things like training mice in one part of the world to do a maze and then faxing, in those days, the maze to another lab in another part of the world and finding that the mice in the other lab would be learning faster because the morphic resonant field, yes? He also talked about how scientists, and particularly PhD students who are working in secret to put together a new chemistry experiment, having their experimental results come out and others having the same results within a few days, sometimes hours. In later experiments documented in The Science of Being Stared At, and in The Dogs Who Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, he demonstrated that our field extends and resonates with others when we look at them with a focused gaze, and that it extends when we intend to call, email, or otherwise reach out to people. He said that people more often than not are aware of someone just before they call, and they can identify who is sending an email. And, as I say, not only people but animals have this ability. He pointed out that it's an ability that makes sense. If an animal can be aware of when a predator is looking at a prey, then they're more likely to survive. And he did many, many experiments using timers and video cameras demonstrating that pets tended to get up and get ready for their owners at the point where the owner started collecting their items at work or wherever they were in preparation for coming home. I got to observe that in a house I was staying in and several times over the last year. In short, Sheldrake offered a theory that overlapped with Jung's model of a collective human consciousness, as he describes in this video clip.
What matters is emotional closeness, not physical distance.
And what do you think is the basis for this? I know you speak of morphic fields and resonance. Does this provide any explanation for these phenomena?
The two conventional theories of the mind are the materialist theory that it's all inside the brain. Brain activity is mental activity. The dualist theory, which has been around for hundreds of years, says the mind and the brain are totally different things. The mind is completely non-physical, immaterial, and not in space and time at all. What I'm putting forward is a theory that's between those two. I'm saying that the mind is in the brain, but it extends beyond it through fields. And we're used to the idea of fields being in and beyond material objects. The magnetic field of a magnet is in the magnet and extends beyond it. The gravitational field of the Earth is in the Earth and extends far beyond it. The field of a mobile phone, a handy, is in the phone and extends beyond it. And I think the fields of our minds are inside our brains and inside our bodies and extend beyond them. So it's not all inside the brain, and these fields connect us to the objects of our attention or intention, and they stretch out far beyond the brain. But they're still, of course, related to the brain, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to influence our actions, which has to happen through the brain.
So, without trying to explain the physics or the neurophysiology, Sheldrake has established in many ways that who we are and how we behave is, as Kurt Lewin suggested, a function of our current environment as much as our history, and affecting that environment in ways we may not be aware of. So then the idea of the mind being some kind of physical field linked to but not limited by the physical brain came into the realm of scientific studies soon after Sheldrake published this work. A Dutch physicist, Dirk Meijer, has published a number of papers in the very last few years documenting the ways in which a, quote, universal information matrix may be contained in the wave patterns of matter energy that modulate in a frequency that it may not even be on the electromagnetic spectrum, but may be on what he calls a generalized music spectrum. He points out that a number of quantum activities go on in the cells of plants and animals that can only be explained by the presence of wave rather than mechanical or chemical activities. There's a number of articles out there in English, thank heavens, but I haven't been able to find a recording of him yet. Who I have been able to find a recording of is Joe McFadden, who is a molecular biologist in England, who's explored the way quantum mechanics works in the body, particularly in genetics, and has built on that work and written a number of books since 2000, suggesting that since the activity of neurons in the brain forms electromagnetic fields, which can be measured and are measured regularly, we do all kinds of scans of those fields, we could perhaps explain how information becomes consciousness, enters into our awareness by understanding how those fields work. In this video clip, he explains that more fully.
I came up with this theory when trying to discover a solution to what's called the binding problem in consciousness. And this is that if you, for example, when you see a visual scene, I can look out the window, I can see trees blowing in the wind, lots of different textures, colors, shapes, orientation of lines. All of these features are encoded in different parts of your brain. There's nowhere, if you look at the neurons of the brain, where those features come together to make a tree. Everything's dissected, and some of it, the colors of the leaves will be off in one part of the brain and their shape will be in another. You can still process that information to generate a response such as there's a tree out there. But it doesn't seem to make sense with our conscious experience where all of it comes together, all of the information is brought together in a single conscious percept of, say, a tree. And it's been a big puzzle. Where is that coming together of all of the information? And there's lots of theories to try to explain it, and none of them, I think, adequately account for it. But it occurred to me that there may be a very simple explanation. Every time a neuron fires, it involves the motion of ions. I mentioned before, motion of ions are electric charged, and any moving charge will generate a magnetic field, an electromagnetic field. This means that the brain, and that all of the neurons, the 100 billion neurons, when they're firing all the time, and you're looking at a tree or anything else, they're generating lots of, if you like, pulses of electromagnetic information into the brain. All of those pulses then kind of overlap and join up to become the brain's electromagnetic field, which is then detected by the techniques that we know about already. EEG, discovered over 100 years ago, that you can detect the brain's electrical field by putting electrodes on the skull. And it's a highly complex electrical structure, as you would expect, because it's generated by the firing of 100 billion neurons. And then the technique of MEG, magnetoencephalography, has been used to detect the magnetic field of the brain, which is also a highly complex structure that is highly dynamic. So we know that the brain has an electromagnetic field. What we know about fields is that they, by their nature, unify information. They are, if you describe an electromagnetic field quantum mechanically, you can describe it as a single equation, a single Schrodinger equation, which will describe all of the features of that field. It can be brought into a single equation. And that means that all of the information is unified in the brain's electromagnetic field. If you could kind of jump onto a photon in the electromagnetic field, it wouldn't matter which way you jumped, you'd meet the same information because the information is overlapping in all of the regions of the brain. And the total brain electromagnetic field has the same physical unity as, say, a single photon or a single electron. It's physically unified. So this is where all of the information in the brain comes together. So it occurred to me that that makes sense as a way of explaining the binding problem. That consciousness may simply be the brain's electromagnetic field. It's where all of the information comes together. If neurons fire asynchronously, then mostly they're going to cancel each other out. So that made a clear prediction about consciousness. For conscious information, the neurons have to fire synchronously. They have to be firing at the same time, firing in step. And that would then generate an electromagnetic field pulse, if you like, that goes off into the brain and becomes our conscious thoughts.
So, with the field theories and models, we begin to have an understanding of how all those trillions of cells in the brain may be related to what we are actually thinking and feeling. There are other models that we will go into that suggest that it isn't actually happening in the brain, but that's another story. At this point, we've moved one more step toward understanding how what we think and how we think generates our mental experience and how we are affecting and affected by the world around us. Well, if you'd like to know more about the nature of these theories, both Sheldrake's books and McFadden's books are highly readable. Sheldrake started in 1981 with his New Science of Life, and in 1982, Morphic Resonance, which was just an expansion on that, introduced the idea and asked people to help substantiate it with experiments. His later books about experiments are entertaining as well as informing. Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and the Sense of Being Stared At are among them, and one of my favorites is his dialogue with Father Matthew Fox called Natural Grace. McFadden offers a marvelously written history of life and science in his book Quantum Evolution, which was published in 2000 by Norton UK, and it introduces some of his theories as well. And then in 2014, he wrote Life on the Edge, The Coming of Age of Quantum Biology. Now, as you can imagine, traditional materialist scientists are quick to criticize and even condemn these works. Sheldrake wasn't allowed to do a talk for TED Talks because it wasn't considered hard science. But they push the frontier of thought and possibility to the limit and are explaining things that no materialist scientist has been able to so far. They are, as Thomas Kuhn pointed out in his classic Structure of Scientific Revolutions, the leading edge of a new paradigm. And it'll be another generation or two before the real value of what they're offering is clear. So over the weeks to come, we'll take a look at others of the many books written on aspects of this science and try to keep up with some new titles as they come out. If you know of a book or video you'd like me to address, please send me an email, ruth@noeticmoments.org, and I will take a look at it. Well, news item. I'm not sure it's so much news, but it is currently in people's awareness. How is it that what has been going on with the COVID is affecting this collective consciousness? I've done quite a bit of recent research around this for the show, and it's been fascinating because the National Institute of Health and the EU equivalent and a number of other institutes have all been saying, whoa, all of this emphasis on death and illness and these lockdowns and all of this is having a profound effect not only on individuals, but on the collective as a whole, and they are feeding each other and reinforcing each other. So that what these various papers in these institutes' annals now are saying is that we have developed a whole new level of existential anxiety at every age level in the world. The concern is if we've got several billion people having an emerging anxiety about their very existence, and we have systems that are actually reinforcing that rather than calming that, what can be done? Fortunately, most of these papers that I've been able to get hold of are saying we really, really need to rethink what we're putting out into the public media. And we also need to educate people on how to deal with anxiety and insecurity. There isn't a whole lot of guidance out there for doing so, and our systems are certainly not structured to reduce anxiety. But at the same time, I've noticed in my own research that there's been a rapid and monumental almost increase in the number of websites, blogs, magazine articles, other kinds of ways to get the word out about mindfulness, about meditation, about calming practices, about self-care and self-love. So there is unofficially at the grassroots level a lot of work being done and a lot being offered to help people deal with this existential anxiety. The other approach that has been recommended, and unfortunately in most detail, for the NIH, our National Institute of Health, is to recognize that existential anxiety can fall into, people suffering from it can fall into deeper, more troubling forms all the way to psychotic anxiety. And it was pointed out in at least one paper that both serotonin and what's called GABA are involved in anxiety, and that there are a number of pharmacological interventions that can affect those. Unfortunately, as most professionals who've dealt with these pharmacological interventions have found, those are not cures. They do not last, but they do offer a space in which someone can stop focusing on what is so distressing and begin to focus on what could be a satisfying and meaningful way of living. And that's really where we need to be. As individuals, as communities, as groups, as support groups, as families, we need to find ways to reintroduce ways of acting and thinking and speaking and being that are fulfilling and meaningful. When I was growing up, my mother and grandmother, my grandmother having been a social worker and missionary, and my mother having learned well from her family, always said that when I was feeling anxious or upset or worried, the thing to do was to focus on how I could serve someone else. How could I care for someone else? Now, at the time, I didn't much appreciate that, but as I've been doing my research, guess what? One of the most effective ways to get beyond our own anxiety about anything is to shift our focus off ourselves and our own needs and concerns and onto the needs and concerns of those around us. And if we can do things like, practice random acts of kindness, or go out and do a little bit of volunteer work that doesn't invest a whole lot of our energy maybe, we can begin to turn that around long before anything like pharmacological or pharmaceutical techniques need to be involved. All right, well, the next time we get together, I'm going to be talking about the work of physicist David Bohm, who reconciles individual experiences with something that he calls the implicate order. I'm looking forward to sharing some of his ideas with you when we get together next Sunday. We're out of time for today. But remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, noeticmoments.org, where there's always a list of titles and links and other resources that we refer to on the show, along with archived shows from the past. And you can always send me your comments and questions, and I'll do my best to get them answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio in heavenly Florence, Oregon. I hope you have a fabulous week. Thanks.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.